Welcome back, everyone, and we will now begin consideration of Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019, Clause 1, short title. Minister Duncan is here with his officials. I would ask that officials please state their names when speaking at the mic. Minister, you can begin by introducing who you have here with you this evening and make your opening remarks.
Sure. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. With me this evening is Sarah Harrison, Deputy Minister, and Kevin Murphy, Assistant Deputy Minister, Resource Management and Compliance Division. The Fisheries Act 1994 has been rewritten and modernized following a complete review, the first time that this has been done since the Act was originally passed. The Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019 will bring consistency and clarity to the regulation of our province's fishery resources while providing modern legislative tools to further implement the results-based regulatory model. Among other things, the Act will support quicker response times to invasive threats, including aquatic invasive species, allow for the provincial protection of aquatic species at risk that are not currently protected under federal legislation, address inconsistencies with the Wildlife Act 1998, giving resource users a clearer understanding of regulatory requirements and allowing for more consistent enforcement, expand the minister's authority regarding prohibitions for aquatic invasive species, allowing ministry staff to respond more effectively to potential threats, and allow for administrative penalties to be applied for some offenses where appropriate. During the development of the new Act, the ministry engaged with First Nations and Métis communities, the Fisheries Advisory Committee, and other stakeholders, and engagement will also continue as the review of the supporting regulations moves forward. With that, we'd be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you, Minister, and I'll open the floor to questions from members, and I'll recognize Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Which First Nations groups did the ministry consult with?
So the ministry emailed an information package in July of 2019 to all the organizations that are represented on the Fisheries Advisory Committee, as well as the First Nation tribal councils and Métis locals to engage with stakeholders and Indigenous groups. We received feedback from the South Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, and the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation.
I was a little curious when the government invites consultation, sometimes of some fairly major and detailed legislation of groups that will be impacted, of course, but then doesn't actually provide any resources to enable those groups to actually dig into things. So it's as though stakeholders are walking around with this, knowledge off the top of their heads about what ministries have planned and what they're proposing to do, but and the government just says, well, tell us what you think about this. We know your budgets are strained, but put a whole bunch of time and energy into telling us whether you think our plan is any good, and then oftentimes nonprofits don't respond because they don't have those resources available to them, and then governments can say, well, we consulted, we let them know what we were doing. So has the ministry ever looked at actually giving any resources to nonprofits to actually dig into, when they're asked, invited to consult? Has the ministry ever looked at actually providing some resources to help a nonprofit group do exactly that?
Thank you. Kevin Murphy, Assistant Deputy Minister for Resource Management and Compliance Division with Environment. With regards to engagement and consultation processes, we typically work with groups at an advisory capacity as we're developing a package to go out. Subsequently, in the invitation for comments, we make it clear that if an organization feels they are struggling with that commentary, to advise us, and we can provide presentation materials, meetings, etc. Typically, we only offer resources to First Nations and Métis through government relations. There is funding available for extended consultation where that's triggered. In this circumstance, government relations indicated to us that the duty consult was low level and information only, and neither First Nations through FSIN nor the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan indicated that they wish to pursue further consultation. We typically don't make funding available to NGOs or other groups, assuming that they have the resources to be able to do that.
Thank you. So one of the things I came across was a fisheries management plan, and it looks to me like the last time that was done was 2010. And is that something that the ministry has any plans to reinstitute? Is there any provision in the legislation, the new legislation, for doing that?
With regards to the fisheries management plan, there aren't provisions in the legislation or regulations that are contemplated about the time frame around that. Rather, we're taking our guidance from the auditor's report that reviewed the plan and gave us some clear direction about timeframes and objectives to meet in terms of maintaining the both consistency of that plan and the ongoing nature of implementing it. So there's no intent on our part to review the plan or renew it, rather to continue to implement it. And we've agreed with the auditor's findings, and we'll be conducting both implementation and revisitation of the audit over the coming 2 years.
As I read the auditor's report, I guess reading between the lines, it seemed to indicate that the ministry didn't have the resources to do some of the activities that the plan called for. Does the ministry need more resources to catch up the items that the auditor noted? I think one was checking water bodies on an annual basis.
In working with the auditor, I think we would characterize it that we need to look at what we need to do with the resources that we have in order to effectively underpin the plan. The auditor is quite correct that if we followed the plan as originally stated, with the number of water bodies there, we would not have been able to complete it. In working with the auditor, what we've been able to demonstrate is that that number was not an appropriate number for us to have set out to have a good management plan for the fishery resource. The number of lakes, the way that we would do it, so perhaps as one specific example, stock trout water bodies are known not to be self-reproducing. We have to restock them with some frequency. We previously had been undertaking a netting program on those lakes, and they were some of the ones identified in that management plan. We've now worked to realize that anglers will tell us when the fishing starts to drop off. That is a sampling program for all intents and purposes, and when we receive that information, we'll restock those water bodies. They are no longer listed as part of the routine for our biologists to go out and sample.
When it comes to, I guess what I would call our major water bodies, are they being sampled on an annual basis?
Typically, no. Generally, we'll look at a 4 or 5 year rotation for major water bodies. We have found that the fish population tends not to change dramatically enough to require management intervention in annual cycles.
Does the Act deal with, I guess what I'd call impacts to fish-bearing water bodies? So whether it's shoreline impacts or industrial activity or releases into water, does the Act deal with that?
The Fisheries Act, Saskatchewan, constitutionally not only does not, but cannot. The Fisheries Act, Canada, oversees the deposition of deleterious substance and habitat management aspects. Depending on the jurisdiction, there is some delegation of those responsibilities, or alternatively, an expectation for the province to undertake some of that. In our particular circumstance, that would be under the Environmental Management and Protection Act and overseen by the Water Security Agency for those habitat aspects. This act will not cover any of those impact to physical habitat aspects.
In the Act, what's the plan for dealing with non-native species of fish that may have gotten themselves into Saskatchewan's water systems?
So we have a list of prohibited species in the Act. The new Act provides some authorities for the minister to oversee private waters that are connected to Crown waters and to change the manner in which those are listed to, if there's an introduction in those, put a protection order in place, which was previously I would describe as unclear legally, so it clarifies that. It allows the minister some more authority to actually list a water body as well as a species for prohibition or control measures. So if we think of if a zebra mussel or something like that were to be introduced to a water, now through a minister's order, the quarantine of that particular water body, whether private or Crown, can be undertaken with a simple minister's order. So those are some of the changes in terms of allowing us better and more reactive control to introduced invasive or problematic species.
The provincial auditor pointed out that the ministry needed to develop specific management plans for key high-risk fish species and high-use water bodies. Does the legislation enable that to occur? Or was that a weakness of the legislation previously?
In my opinion, that would not have been a weakness of the previous legislation, and we haven't contemplated those specific aspects in the revision of the Act.
So the legislation doesn't specifically require that those management plans be done or any sort of frequency or anything like that? So am I understanding that right?
Correct.
So in terms of the auditor's direction that the ministry needs to prepare timely reports, that will just, there's nothing in the legislation to require that?
Correct.
And when the auditor's report says that the ministry needs to assess fish populations and their health using an established risk-based interval, proven sampling techniques, and science-based protocols for field data collection, that's not specifically set out in the Act either. Is that right?
That's correct.
The Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, is that covered by this legislation?
No, that'd be covered by a separate piece of legislation. Enhancement of the fishery is undertaken under the Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, and of course the licenses that are sold pursuant to this Act, the monies from that are what is contributed to the fund, but it's a separate piece of legislation.
How does the legislation deal with the increasing pressure of climate change, or does it take into, is there anything specifically that takes that into account?
The only specifics in the way the Act is being changed that speak to what would be climate change or other pervasive factors would be around introduction of aquatic invasive species and their control, and then the general provisions of management of the fishery. I think that the management plan and the auditor's recommendations speak more to the kind of monitoring changes to understand those impacts that we'd really be discussing. The Act itself doesn't contemplate one pervasive risk over another.
What concerns were raised by stakeholders in connection with the new legislation?
Do you have?
So I'll give Assistant Deputy Minister a little bit of a breather here. There were some concerns raised on, one of the groups raised just how conservation officers, what assurances that conservation officers would have the ability to confirm the license had been purchased. Concern was raised on how administrative penalties would be implemented and how the ministry would decide which aquatic species to protect and the process to decide how species would be added or removed from the list. One of the groups identified a grammatical error, and just some concern in terms of how the Federal Species Risk Act, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and the Water Security Agency's involvement in habitat would be integrated with the ministry's intention to regulate habitat with respect to aquatic species at risk. There was a perceived inconsistency around things like search and seizure, for example. So those were the extent of the concerns that were raised in the feedback.
What are the, I guess, the ministry's search and seizure powers in the new legislation? And I guess I'd be acting through conservation officers. Has that changed?
Okay. It hasn't changed.
Okay. I know that at least at one point in time, the province, even though you could buy your fishing license online, and in fact we're encouraged to buy your fishing license online, that there is a requirement that you actually have a printed out paper copy of that fishing license. Is that still the requirement of the ministry, or has that been changed?
That's changed with this act.
Okay, so an angler will now be able to just produce a digital copy.
That's correct.
Did seem a little contradictory that you could buy it online, but had to then print it out. I think those are all my questions, Madam Chair.
Okay. Seeing that there are no further questions on this bill, I will move to moving it as well. And I ask you to bear with me as there are 71 clauses in this bill. Clause 1, short title. Is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 9, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 10, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 11, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 12, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 13, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 14, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 15, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 16, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 17, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 18, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 19, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 20, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 21, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 22, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 23, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 24, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 25, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 26, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 27, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 28, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 29, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 30, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 31, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 32, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 33, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 34, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 35, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 36, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 37, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 38, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 39, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 40, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 41, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 42, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 43, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 44, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 45, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 46, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 47, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 48, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 49, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 50, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 51, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 52, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 53, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 54, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 55, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 56, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 57, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 58, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 59, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 60, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 61, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 62, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 63, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 64, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 65, is that agreed? Carried. That's a long one. Clause 66, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 67, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 68, is that agreed? Clause 69, is that agreed? Carried. On 68, Clause 69, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 70, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 71 coming into force, is that agreed? Carried. Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, enacts as follows the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. I would ask a member to move that we report Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019, without amendment. Mr. Buckingham so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Minister, any closing remarks on this bill before we move on to the next one?
No, I would just thank the committee for their consideration. I think we have just the one final bill. Okay.
Consequential Amendment Act.
I'll probably do my closing remarks after that one.
All right. We will now move on to consideration of Bill number 184, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendments Act 2019. And Minister, if you have any opening remarks on that bill.
Very quick remarks here. This is just the update, reference, and definitions in other bilingual acts. there's no implications with the additional consequential amendment bills as they are housekeeping in nature. And so we'd be pleased to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Minister. I'll open the floor to questions from members, and I'll recognize Mr. Peterson.
I assume the consultations that the ministry went through on this legislation were basically the same as the last bill we just dealt with.
That's correct.
Those are all the questions that I have.
All right. Seeing no further questions on this bill, we'll move to pass it. Clause 1, short title, is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Clause 2, is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Clause 3, is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Clause 4, is that agreed? Agreed. Oh, Clause 4, no, it's short one. Coming into force, is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. Man. Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, enacts as follows: the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendments Act 2019. I would ask a member to move that we report Bill number 184. Without amendment, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendments Act 2019 without amendment. Mr. O'Lawson so moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Now, Minister, if you have any closing remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank Mr. Peterson for his questions, the committee for their deliberations in moving this bill back to the Assembly for a final vote. And I want to thank the ministry staff, particularly the Deputy Minister and Assistant Deputy Minister that are here this evening. I also want to thank and note for the record his presence for both our earlier session and our evening session, although he didn't make it into Hansard earlier. Ryan Clark is Executive Assistant to the Deputy Minister, and so I want to acknowledge Ryan's presence here this evening. And with that, we thank the committee for your deliberations.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Peterson, if you have any.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to thank the ministry and the officials for their work on the legislation and managing the provincial resource. Obviously, this is an important one, so appreciate their work on this. And obviously, thanks to the committee members as well.
Thank you. I would ask a member now to move a motion of adjournment. Mr. Buckingham so moves. Is that agreed? Agreed. Carried. We now stand. That concludes our business for this evening.